Derek Carter faces daily discrimination at Harper Manufacturing, where despite his skills, he's met with sabotage and hostility. When he finally earns a promotion, his challenges only grow worse. Isolated and undermined at every turn, Derek reaches a breaking point that forces him to make a life-altering decision. But when a surprising opportunity opens a new door, Derek's journey takes an unexpected twist, leading him to question everything he's endured. Can he rise above his past and find the peace and success he deserves? Hit subscribe, drop a comment below, and stay tuned to see how Derek's powerful story of resilience unfolds. Don't miss out on more stories like this. Like and share to support the channel. Derek Carter stood in front of the steel gates of Harper Manufacturing, the cold wind biting his skin as the morning whistle blew. The sound marked the start of another day, another battle. He adjusted the worn cap on his head and inhaled deeply, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Derek had worked at the factory for 10 years, his skills honed over countless hours of labor. But it felt as though he was still walking through those gates for the first time, constantly trying to prove his worth. The factory floor was a chaotic symphony of machines, clanking metal, and shouted orders. It was here that Derek spent his days, working alongside men who looked at him with disdain, whispering in corners, making snide remarks whenever they thought he wasn't paying attention. He was the only black man on the line, and while his work spoke for itself, the others refused to acknowledge it. "Hey, Carter," a voice broke through the din. Derek turned to see Jake Patterson, his supervisor, standing with a clipboard in hand. Jake had a smirk that never seemed to leave his face. "You plan on keeping up today, we don't need any slowpokes dragging us down." Derek clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest. He was used to the insults, the subtle digs that chipped away at him day by day. He nodded silently, picking up his tools and heading toward his station, determined not to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Behind him, he could hear Sam Brooks and Ryan Taylor snickering, their laughter slicing through the noise of the factory like glass. As Derek worked, his mind wandered to his wife, Amber, and their small house just outside of town. She was the only one who really understood the weight he carried, though even she didn't know the full extent of the hostility he faced daily. They had built a life together, one of quiet resilience, and Amber had always been his rock. But as the hours passed, Derek couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that things would never change. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he excelled, he would always be the outsider. It was at the start of Derek's shift the next day when the announcement was made. Ryan Taylor, the factory manager, called everyone into the break room. His sharp suit was a stark contrast to the grease-stained overalls of the workers around him. Derek stood toward the back, arms crossed, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. Ryan cleared his throat. "We're opening up a position for a new supervisor. It's an internal promotion, so if any of you think you have what it takes, submit your application by the end of the week." The room buzzed with murmurs. Derek's heart skipped a beat. A promotion. He had been working here for a decade, doing more than his fair share, and he had more experience than most of the men on the floor. This could be his chance. He'd been passed over before, but maybe this time would be different. As Derek left the break room, he overheard a group of workers talking. "You think Carter's gonna try for it?" Sam Brooks asked, a sneer in his voice. "He'd be a fool if he did," Mike Travis, the loudest and most aggressive of Derek's co-workers, replied. "That position's not for people like him." Derek clenched his fists but said nothing. He had learned long ago that confronting them would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on his work, letting their words slide off him like rainwater. But deep down, the seed of doubt had already been planted. When Derek got home that evening, Amber was waiting for him at the kitchen table. She could read the stress on his face immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting aside her book. "They're opening up a supervisor position," Derek said quietly, sitting down across from her. "I think I'm going to apply?" Amber reached for his hand. "You should. You've earned it, Derek. Don't let them make you feel like you don't belong." He looked into her eyes, seeing the unwavering belief she had in him. It was moments like these that made him feel strong again, like he could take on the world. But even with Amber's support, the doubts lingered. By the end of the week, Derek had submitted his application. It wasn't a complicated process, just a few forms and a formal statement of interest. Still, it felt monumental, like he was making a stand. His hands trembled slightly as he handed the paperwork to the secretary. "Good luck," she said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The following days were tense. Derek could feel the shift in the air every time he walked onto the factory floor. Whispers followed him like shadows, and the glances from his coworkers grew colder, more calculating. He caught snippets of conversations that weren't meant for his ears. "Can you believe Carter's actually trying for it?" Sam muttered to Jake one afternoon. Jake scoffed. "It's a joke. There's no way they're giving that position to him." But Derek wasn't laughing. He worked harder than ever, refusing to let their words get to him. If there was one thing he knew how to do, it was proving himself through action. His hands moved swiftly and skillfully, producing more than anyone else on the line. But still, it never seemed to be enough. At home, Amber was his anchor. She'd rub his shoulders after a long day, reminding him that he was worth more than what those men thought of him. But even her soothing words couldn't erase the tension that was growing inside him. The job had become more than a way to provide for his family, it had become a test of his dignity, of whether or not he could survive in a world that was determined to push him down. The day of the interview finally arrived. Derek woke up before the sun, unable to sleep from the nerves twisting in his stomach. He dressed carefully, choosing the cleanest shirt he owned, and kissed Amber before heading out the door. At the factory, the atmosphere was charged. Derek walked into the office where Ryan Taylor and two other supervisors sat behind a large wooden desk. They greeted him politely, but the tension in the room was palpable. The interview started with standard questions about his experience, his leadership style, how he would handle conflict. Derek answered with confidence, drawing from years of working in high-pressure situations. He knew the job inside and out, and he wasn't afraid to show it. But as he spoke, he could see the skepticism in Ryan's eyes, the barely concealed doubt. Still, Derek pushed through, determined not to let his nerves show. This was his chance, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. When the interview ended, Derek walked out of the office feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. He had done his best, but the nagging doubt remained. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but there was nothing more he could do now except wait. As he walked back to the factory floor, he saw the smirks on his coworkers' faces. They didn't have to say anything. Derek knew what they were thinking. They were already celebrating his failure. Derek could barely keep his mind on work the day after the interview. His thoughts raced with the possibilities, swinging between hope and doubt. Around him, the factory buzzed with its usual noise, but today felt different, charged, like something big was about to happen. At midday, Ryan Taylor's voice echoed through the factory floor over the PA system, calling everyone to the break room for an announcement. Derek's pulse quickened as he set down his tools and joined the crowd. Workers shuffled in, glancing at one another, sharing knowing looks. Derek kept to the back, his stomach twisting with anticipation. Ryan stood at the front of the room, his expression as unreadable as ever. "I want to thank everyone who applied for the supervisor position," he began, his voice calm and professional. "It wasn't an easy decision. We had many strong candidates." Derek felt the words press down on him. He could practically hear the thoughts of those around him. There's no way they'll give it to him. His heart pounded in his chest as Ryan continued, his words blurring together in Derek's anxious haze. And after careful consideration, Ryan said, pausing for dramatic effect, "The new supervisor will be Derek Carter." The room fell into stunned silence. Derek blinked, trying to process the words. He had done it. Against all odds, he had been chosen. But the silence in the room wasn't celebratory, it was cold, resentful. Derek's elation quickly faded as he looked around and saw the glares, the disbelief, the clenched jaws of his coworkers. Ryan nodded toward Derek. "Congratulations, Derek. We're looking forward to seeing what you bring to the position." A few scattered claps followed, but they felt forced, reluctant. Derek swallowed hard, trying to push down the sinking feeling in his gut. He had earned this. He deserved this. But as he left the break room, the weight of the stares and whispered conversations trailed after him like a dark cloud. If Derek thought things were difficult before, he hadn't anticipated the level of hostility that followed his promotion. The resentment that had simmered beneath the surface now boiled over into open defiance. His first week as supervisor was a nightmare. "Carter, we've got a problem over at Station 5, Jake Patterson called out one morning, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Derek made his way to Station 5, where the machine was malfunctioning. He gave clear instructions to Bill Hendricks, the worker assigned to the machine, on how to fix the issue. Bill nodded curtly, but as soon as Derek turned his back, he did the opposite of what Derek had said, making the problem worse. When Derek confronted him about it, Bill shrugged. "Guess I didn't hear you right." It wasn't just Bill. Every day, Derek faced more acts of subtle sabotage. Machines left unattended, instructions ignored, deadlines missed. Workers who used to perform perfectly well were suddenly making mistakes that dragged down the entire line's productivity. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and it wasn't long before Ryan Taylor came knocking on Derek's door. Ryan leaned against the doorway of Derek's office, arms crossed. "Productivity's down, Derek. We're missing deadlines." "What's going on?" Derek felt the heat rise in his chest. He knew exactly what was going on, but saying it out loud would only make things worse. "Some of the guys are adjusting to the new structure," Derek said carefully. "I'm handling it?" Ryan's eyes narrowed. "Handle it quickly. The higher-ups won't tolerate this for long." As Ryan walked away, Derek felt the weight of the ultimatum. He had only been in the position for a week, and already his team was undermining him at every turn. But instead of folding, Derek doubled down. He pushed himself harder, working late hours to compensate for his team's failures, trying to set an example. But no matter how hard he tried, the cracks in the foundation were widening. By the end of the month, the hostility had escalated from quiet sabotage to something more dangerous. The final straw came late one night when Derek stayed late to finish paperwork. The factory floor was deserted, the machines quiet for the first time all day. Derek was packing up his things when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see a group of his co-workers Mike Travis at the front, flanked by a few others, their expressions hard and unwelcoming. They blocked the exit, their presence thick with menace. "Working late, huh?" Mike said, his voice low and mocking. "Guess you've got to, considering you can't keep things together during the day." Derek's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. "I've got work to do, Mike. If you've got something to say it." Mike smirked, glancing at the others. "Oh, I've got plenty to say. We all do. You don't belong here, Carter. Never did. You think wearing that supervisor badge changes anything? You're still just the same as you've always been. Out of place." Derek stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides. "I earned this job, just like I earned my place here." "Yeah," Mike stepped closer, his face inches from Derek's. "Let's see you earn your way out of this." The first punch came so fast Derek barely had time to react. It hit him square in the jaw, sending him stumbling backward. The others closed in, fists flying. Derek fought back, blocking blows as best he could, but he was outnumbered. The hits rained down, sharp and unrelenting, until Derek collapsed to the ground. They left him there, bruised and bleeding, muttering insults as they walked away. Derek lay on the cold factory floor for what felt like hours, his body aching, his mind spinning. He had never felt more humiliated, more broken. When he finally managed to pull himself to his feet, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, Derek walked into Ryan Taylor's office, his face still swollen from the night before. He explained what had happened, hoping for some form of justice. But Ryan's response was as cold as the factory floor. "You should have just walked away," he said, his eyes flicking to the paperwork on his desk, as if Derek's words were little more than an inconvenience. "We can't have incidents like this affecting productivity. Keep your head down and don't stir up trouble." Derek stared at Ryan in disbelief. His body ached from the beating, but the indifference in Ryan's voice cut deeper than any punch. This wasn't just about his coworkers anymore, it was the entire system. No matter how hard he worked, no matter what he did, he was fighting a losing battle. The days that followed were a blur of pain and frustration. Derek's body healed, but the emotional wounds were harder to recover from. Amber noticed the change in him, how he barely spoke when he got home. how the fire in his eyes seemed to dim. He still showed up to work every day, but the weight of the factory's toxic environment was crushing him. Amber tried to console him, urging him to leave the job for his own sake. "You don't deserve this," she whispered one night, her voice full of concern. "You deserve better." But Derek couldn't bring himself to walk away. Leaving felt like admitting defeat, and he had never been one to quit. He had fought for everything in his life, and giving up now felt like letting them win. At work, the sabotage continued. His team's productivity dropped to an all-time low, and Derek could see the frustration on Ryan Taylor's face each time he walked the floor. But instead of addressing the real issue, the hostility and defiance from his coworkers, Ryan placed the blame squarely on Derek. "If things don't improve, we're going to have to reconsider your position," Ryan said during one of their increasingly frequent meetings. Derek left the office feeling like the walls were closing in. He was trapped. His team refused to follow his lead. His manager refused to support him. And every day felt like a battle he was destined to lose. One afternoon, after another grueling day of dealing with defiant workers and missed deadlines, Derek returned to his locker to find something that made his blood run cold. Taped to the front of his locker was a note, hastily scrawled on a scrap of paper. It read, "Leave while you still can." Derek's hands shook as he pulled the note down, crumpling it in his fist. The threat was clear, and for the first time, real fear gripped him. This wasn't just about sabotage or insults anymore. This was personal. This was dangerous. He took the note straight to Ryan's office, hoping despite everything that this would be the thing that finally forced Ryan to act. But Ryan barely glanced at the note before shrugging. "You're overreacting," he said. "It's just a prank. Don't let it get to you." Derek stared at him in disbelief. "A prank, Ryan? This is a threat. I don't feel safe here." Ryan leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "Maybe you should take some time off. Clear your head. We can't afford to have you distracted. Maybe stepping back for a bit would be best." Derek felt the final thread of hope snap. He left the office without another word, the note still crumpled in his hand. Ryan didn't care. No one did. And for the first time, Derek seriously considered walking away. But walking away felt like surrender. It felt like letting them win. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table with Amber, he realized something: this wasn't a fight he could win. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried to prove himself, the system was stacked against him from the start. The factory wasn't just a place of work, it was a battleground, and Derek was fighting a losing war. The next morning, Derek made his decision. He walked into the factory with his head held high, ignoring the snickers and glares from his co-workers. He went straight to Ryan's office and handed in his resignation. Ryan barely looked surprised. "Are you sure this is what you want?" he asked, his tone indifferent. Derek nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace. "I deserve better than this," he said firmly. As he left the office for the last time, Derek felt lighter than he had in years. The factory, once a prison of discrimination and hostility, was finally behind him. The sun had barely risen when Derek left Harper Manufacturing for the last time. The factory, a place that had once been his livelihood, had become a weight around his neck. As he drove home, the streets blurred by, and a strange numbness set in. The relief of leaving the toxic environment was mixed with fear of the unknown, of the uncertainty that lay ahead. When Derek walked into the house, Amber was in the kitchen, sipping coffee, her face lighting up when she saw him. But her smile faltered when she noticed the resignation in his eyes. "You left," she said softly, setting her cup down. "You really did it." Derek nodded, his voice quiet. "I couldn't stay there anymore, Amber. Not after everything that's happened. It was killing me." Amber crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "I know," she whispered, her breath warm against his neck. "I'm proud of you. You did the right thing." But as comforting as her words were, they couldn't drown out the doubt gnawing at Derek's mind. Was it the right thing he had left behind? A steady paycheck, a familiar if hostile environment, and now he was stepping into the unknown. What if things didn't get better? What if he had just thrown away the only opportunity he would ever get? The first few days after his resignation passed in a haze. Derek spent most of his time at home, sending out resumes and applying for jobs, But the silence in the house was suffocating. Without the factory, his days felt aimless. He had spent so long fighting to prove himself, and now that the fight was over, he felt lost. Amber tried to be supportive, but Derek could see the worry in her eyes. The weight of it all was beginning to crush him. The world outside felt cold and indifferent, and without the daily routine of the factory, awful as it had been, he felt like he was drifting, unmoored. Weeks passed, and the job rejections piled up. Every day, Derek sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, searching for anything that might fit his skill set. But each interview seemed to go the same way. Polite nods, a few questions, and then the inevitable brush-off. Well, be in touch. But they never were. The longer Derek went without a job, the heavier the silence between him and Amber became. She never said it outright, but Derek could feel the strain. The bills were piling up, and the pressure to provide was growing by the day. Amber had picked up extra hours at the hospital where she worked, but Derek knew it wasn't sustainable. One evening, after yet another rejection email, Derek sat slumped at the table, staring blankly at the screen. Amber walked in, her face etched with concern. "Derek," she said, sitting down across from him, "you've got to give yourself a break. You've been through so much, it's going to take time to find something new." Derek rubbed his hands over his face, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't have time, Amber. We don't have time. I should have never left the factory." "Don't say that," Amber said, her voice firm. "You did the right thing by leaving. They didn't deserve you." Derek sighed, feeling the weight of his decision more acutely than ever. "But what if this is it? What if there isn't anything better for me out there? I don't know anymore." Amber reached across the table and took his hand. "You're not defeated, Derek. You're stronger than this. You'll find something. You just have to believe in yourself." Derek wanted to believe her, but deep down, the fear of failure gnawed at him. The factory had been a hellish place, but at least it had been familiar. Now, everything felt uncertain, and the weight of that uncertainty threatened to crush him. Just when Derek felt like he was running out of options, his phone rang one afternoon. He almost didn't answer, thinking it was another rejection call. But when he saw the name on the screen, Chris Morgan, he hesitated, then picked up. Chris had been a good friend back in high school, but they had drifted apart over the years. Derek hadn't spoken to him in months, maybe even longer. "Hey!" Derek Chris' voice was upbeat, a sharp contrast to the gloom that had settled over Derek's life. "I heard you're not working at Harper anymore. What happened?" Derek hesitated. "It's a long story." "Yeah, I bet," Chris replied. "Listen, man, I know this is probably out of the blue, but I might have something for you. I'm working over at this tech company Grayson Tech and we're hiring. I know it's not manufacturing, but I think you've got the skills to make the transition." Derek blinked, surprised. "Tech, I don't know. Man, I've been working in factories my whole life. I'm not sure I'd fit in." Chris laughed. "You'd be surprised. We need people who know how to manage teams, solve problems, and get things done. You've got that in spades. Besides, I could put in a good word for you. Just think about it, okay?" Derek sat there, phone in hand, staring at the screen long after Chris hung up. A tech jobs. It sounded completely outside of his comfort zone, but maybe that's exactly what he needed. Something new. Something different. The factory had chewed him up and spat him out. Maybe it was time to start fresh. After a few days of mulling it over, and with Amber's encouragement, Derek decided to take Chris up on his offer. He applied for the position at Grayson Tech, and true to his word, Chris helped smooth the process along. The interview process felt worlds apart from the grueling factory life Derek had known. Instead of loud machinery and oil-stained floors, Grayson Tech's office was sleek, modern, and quiet. The team who interviewed him seemed genuinely interested in his leadership experience and how he handled conflict skills that Derek had in abundance. When Derek left the interview, he felt something he hadn't in a long time hoped. A few days later, the offer came. It wasn't just a job, it was a fresh start. For the first time in months, Derek felt like he could breathe again. Derek felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. The office was calm, the people friendly. Chris introduced him to the team, and within the first hour, Derek could tell that this was different. There were no whispered conversations behind his back, no mocking looks or sabotage. For the first time in years, Derek felt like he belonged. The smell of fresh coffee and the hum of quiet conversations filled the air as Derek walked into Grayson Tech for his second week on the job. It had only been a few days since he'd started, but already the difference from his old life at Harper Manufacturing was striking. Gone were the grating sounds of machines, the glares from hostile coworkers, and the constant pressure of needing to prove his worth. Here, the atmosphere was calm, professional, and respectful. Derek was assigned to manage a small team working on a logistics project. He'd been worried at first that his experience from the factory wouldn't translate to the tech world, but he quickly realized that leadership was about people, no matter where you worked. The team listened to him, valued his input, and worked with him to solve problems, not against him. "Good work today, Derek," said Samantha Green, the project lead, as she passed by his desk one evening. "I appreciate how quickly you're picking things up." Derek smiled, nodding. "Thanks, Sam. It's been a good experience so far." "Different, but good." "Different can be good," Samantha replied with a warm smile. "You've brought a fresh perspective to the team. Keep it up." Her words echoed in Derek's mind as he finished up for the day. He felt something unfamiliar growing inside him, confidence. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Grayson Tech had given him the opportunity to show his skills in a place where race didn't define his position. Every day he came to work, the old wounds from Harper felt a little less raw. Amber noticed the change in him too. When Derek came home, he wasn't exhausted and withdrawn anymore. Instead, they'd sit at the dinner table and actually talk about their future. About Derek's plans, about life in general. The cloud that had hung over their home for so long was finally lifting. But while Derek's new life was coming together, the shadows of his past still lingered. There were days when memories of the factory crept into his thoughts. Moments when he questioned whether he had truly moved on. 2 months into his new job, Derek received an email that reopened old wounds. The sender's name was one he hadn't expected to see, Tom Harrison, a former co-worker from Harper Manufacturing. Derek stared at the screen for a moment before opening the message, unsure of what it would contain. The email was brief but sincere. "Hey, Derek, I've been thinking about what happened after you left. I'm not proud of how things went down at the factory, and I wanted to say, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve any of it, and you handled yourself with more strength than I think any of us gave you credit for. Since you left, the factory's changed. Management finally started taking complaints seriously after your resignation, and they've introduced new policies. I guess you forced them to wake up. I just wanted to reach out and tell you that you made a difference. Hope you're doing well, Tom." Derek leaned back in his chair, reading the email again. The apology was unexpected, and while it didn't erase the pain of what he had been through, it gave him a strange sense of closure. He had left the factory feeling defeated, but in some way, his departure had sparked change. Even if it had come too late for him, his struggles had not been in vain. That night, Derek shared the email with Amber. She read it silently, then looked up at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "You forced them to see the truth," she said. "You stood your ground, even when it felt impossible. And now they had to face it." Derek nodded, but a part of him still felt conflicted. The factory had caused him so much pain, and while it was good to know things had improved, it didn't change the fact that he had been the one to suffer in the process. "I don't know if he'll ever fully forgive them," Derek admitted, "but at least I can move forward, knowing that something good came out of it." Amber squeezed his hand. "And now you can focus on what's ahead. You've built a new life, Derek, one that's not tied to all the pain they put you through." Derek felt a weight lift from his chest as he listened to her. Amber was right, he didn't need to carry the burden of his past anymore. He had taken the first steps toward healing, and the path ahead was one he would walk with his head held high. As the months passed, Derek's confidence grew. He took on more responsibility at Grayson Tech, leading his team with the same level of integrity and work ethic that he had at the factory, but without the fear of sabotage or resentment. His new co-workers respected him, and for the first time, Derek felt like he was part of something bigger, a team that worked together, not against each other. One day, Chris Morgan, His old friend and the one who had helped him land the job pulled him aside during a break. "Hey, Derek, I've been meaning to ask you something," Chris said, leaning against the break room counter. "There's an opening for a senior leadership position coming up soon, and I think you'd be a great fit." Derek blinked, surprised. "Me, a senior leader? I've only been here a few months." Chris shrugged. "Doesn't matter. You've got the skills and people notice. You've been killing it since you got here." Derek felt a rush of emotions, excitement, disbelief, but most of all, pride. A promotion. Another chance to prove himself, but this time it wasn't about survival or overcoming hate. This was about growth, about moving forward on his own terms. "He'll think about it," Derek said, but deep down, he already knew his answer. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Over the next few weeks, Derek prepared for the interview, reflecting on how far he had come. At Harper, he had been surrounded by people who doubted him, who tried to drag him down at every turn. But here, at Grayson Tech, his coworkers lifted him up. They saw his potential and wanted him to succeed. The day of the interview came, and Derek walked into the room with confidence. The panel asked questions about his leadership style, his problem-solving abilities, and his vision for the team. Derek answered each question with clarity, drawing from his experiences not just at Grayson Tech, but from his time at Harper as well. The hardships he had faced had shaped him, and now they were fueling his success. When the interview ended, Derek felt a sense of calm wash over him. Whether he got the promotion or not, he knew he had found his place. For the first time in years, Derek felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. A week after the interview, Derek got the call. He had been promoted to senior leadership at Grayson Tech. When he hung up the phone, he sat back in his chair, a smile spreading across his face. The journey had been long and painful, filled with moments of doubt, fear, and anger, but he had made it. He had risen above the hate, the discrimination, and the toxic environment that had once threatened to break him. Amber was waiting for him when he got home, and as soon as he walked through the door, she knew. She rushed to him, hugging him tightly, pride shining in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," Derek corrected, holding her close. Amber had been his rock through it all, and without her support, he wasn't sure he would have made it. Later that evening, as Derek stood on the porch, the cool night air brushing against his skin, he reflected on everything that had led him to this moment. The factory had been a battleground, one where he had fought tirelessly, only to walk away bruised and battered. But leaving Harper had been the best decision of his life. It had opened the door to something new, something better. As he gazed up at the clear sky, Derek felt at peace. He had found his voice, his strength, and his purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Derek knew that whatever challenges lay in his path, he would face them with the same resilience that had carried him through his darkest days. In the distance, he could hear the faint hum of traffic, life moving on around him. And for the first time in a long time, Derek felt ready for whatever came next. The promotion at Grayson Tech brought Derek a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. His days were busy but rewarding, filled with challenges that pushed him to grow as a leader. He was no longer just managing tasks, he was mentoring new employees, shaping company policies, and building a team that thrived on cooperation and mutual respect. But even with all the success, the weight of his past at Harper Manufacturing still lingered at the back of his mind. There were nights when Derek would wake up, heart pounding, as memories of the factory resurfaced, the whispered insults, the constant sabotage, the brutal attack in the parking lot. These were scars that didn't fade easily, even in the face of new achievements. One evening, as Derek sat at home preparing for an important meeting the next day, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was another email from Tom Harrison, his former co-worker at Harper. The subject line read, "We need to talk." Derek hesitated before opening the message. He had appreciated Tom's previous apology, but part of him still didn't want to reopen the door to that chapter of his life. "Hey, Derek, I know it's been a while since I last reached out, but something's come up that I think you should know about. There's been a lot of changes at Harper since you left, and some of the guys are talking about trying to unionize to prevent the kind of treatment you went through from happening to anyone else. I know you've moved on, and I'm glad for that, but if you're willing, they could really use your voice. You're the reason this conversation is even happening in the first place. You've got a lot of respect around here now, even from guys who didn't treat you right back then. I think your input could really make a difference. Think about it, Tom. Derek stared at the screen, unsure how to feel. Unionization. It was something he had never imagined would happen at Harper. The idea that his experience, his pain, had sparked such a significant change was both empowering and deeply emotional. But at the same time, the thought of stepping back into that world, even to help, was overwhelming. Amber found him sitting in the living room, lost in thought, the email still open on his phone. She sat beside him, her hand resting on his. "What's on your mind?" she asked gently. Derek handed her the phone, letting her read the message. When she finished, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "It's a lot to think about," she said. "But you don't have to go back, Derek. You've done so much already and you've built a new life. You don't owe them anything." Derek nodded, grateful for her support. But something in him stirred. He had left Harper to protect himself, to escape the toxic environment that had nearly broken him. But now he had an opportunity to return on his own terms, to make a lasting impact, not just for himself, but for the people who were still there. "I know," Derek said after a long pause. "But maybe this is a chance to turn something terrible into something good." A few days later, Derek found himself driving toward Harper Manufacturing for the first time since he had resigned. The sun was setting as he pulled into the parking lot, casting long shadows across the pavement. The factory loomed in the distance, just as it had for the 10 years he had worked there. But something felt different now. It no longer had the power to control him. Derek stepped out of the car, his heart steady but heavy. He wasn't here for revenge or validation. He was here to make sure that the cycle of abuse and discrimination didn't continue for others. Tom was waiting for him by the entrance, looking older and wearier than Derek remembered. He offered Derek a tentative smile and extended his hand. "Thanks for coming, man. I didn't know if you'd want to." Derek shook his hand, the tension between them no longer carrying the weight it once had. "I wasn't sure either," he admitted. "But if there's a chance to change things, I want to help." Tom led Derek inside, where a small group of workers had gathered in one of the meeting rooms. Some of the faces were familiar, men Derek had worked alongside for years, but others were new. The air was thick with a mix of uncertainty and hope. "Derek," Tom said, addressing the group, "this is the guy who started it all, whether he knew it or not. Has the reason we're here talking about making this place better." Derek felt a wave of emotion wash over him as the group turned to him. He hadn't come back expecting gratitude, but seeing the respect in their eyes was a stark contrast to the hostility he had endured for so long. "I don't need to tell you all what it was like here," Derek began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "We all know how toxic this place can be, how people get treated when they're different. I went through it, and I know some of you did too." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But we have a chance to change that now," he continued. "If we can come together, if we can demand better treatment, fair policies, and respect, we can make sure no one else has to go through what I went through." The room was silent for a moment, and then one of the younger workers spoke up. "Do you think it's really possible? I mean, after everything that happened?" Derek nodded. "It's possible. It won't be easy, but it's possible. And the fact that you're all here, talking about it, means you've already taken the first step." For the next hour, Derek and the group discussed the unionization efforts, sharing stories of what they'd faced and their hopes for the future. By the end of the meeting, Derek felt a sense of closure that he hadn't realized he needed. He wasn't here to fight for himself anymore. He was here to make sure the system changed for good. As he left the factory that night, Derek felt lighter, as if a long-held weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He had faced his past, but this time he had walked away on his own terms, not as a victim, but as a leader. A few months later, Harper Manufacturing's workers voted to unionize. The news spread quickly through the town, and Derek heard about it from Tom, who thanked him again for his help. But for Derek, the real victory was not in the headlines. It was in knowing that the place that had once tried to break him had been forced to change. Derek continued to thrive at Grayson Tech, embracing his role as a senior leader and mentoring others who were just starting their careers. The pain of his past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. He had built a life where he was valued, respected, and, most importantly, free. One evening, as Derek and Amber sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Derek smiled to himself. The journey had been long, filled with darkness and struggle, but he had come out the other side stronger. He had found his place in the world, and for the first time in his life, he knew that he belonged. No matter what challenges lay ahead, Derek was ready for them. If you found Derek's journey inspiring and powerful, don't forget to hit subscribe to stay connected with more stories of resilience, perseverance, and triumph. We've got more compelling narratives that will challenge, uplift, and remind you of the strength we all carry within. Make sure to like, share, and comment below your thoughts, and feedback are always welcome. Stay tuned for more stories that shine a light on the power of hope and the human spirit. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The old colonel had come through on his promise. Had mobilized a federal task force, putting together a team of agents who specialized in organized crime. They were ready to strike, but timing was critical. "Everything's in place," McCaffrey said over the phone. "But we've got a small window? We've been monitoring Lang's movements, and he's suspicious. It's only a matter of time before he starts tying up loose ends. We need to act now." Joe's jaw clenched as he considered the next steps. "What's the plan?" "We're going to hit Lang's operations across the state," McCaffrey replied. "Simultaneous raids on his warehouses, his drug routes, his money laundering schemes. We'll cripple his network, but we need to catch him in the act. If Lang goes underground, we lose him." Joe's mind raced. Lang wasn't going to be an easy target. He was too smart, too careful. They needed something that would force him to act, something that would draw him out of hiding. "I'll get him out in the open," Joe said, his voice steady. McCaffrey was silent for a moment, then he sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that. You're putting yourself in the line of fire, Joe. This isn't like the old days." Joe's expression didn't change. "I know what I'm doing, Robert." McCaffrey's tone softened. "Just be careful. I'll have my agents ready. You give me the signal, and we move." The sun was beginning to set as Joe and Sam made their way to the outskirts of Riverside, to an abandoned warehouse that Lang used to store some of his more illicit goods. It was the perfect place for a final showdown. Joe had been careful to spread the word quietly, knowing it would get back to Lang through his informants. Lang wouldn't be able to resist coming to see what Joe Harris had in store for him. As they approached the warehouse, Joe's pulse quickened, though his outward appearance remained calm. He had been in dangerous situations before, and his military training kicked in automatically. He was no longer the old man sitting on his porch. He was the soldier, the fighter, the man who had survived hell and come back stronger. "Are you sure about this?" Sam asked, his voice tense as they parked the truck just outside the warehouse. Joe glanced at his grandson, his eyes filled with determination. "This is the only way." Sam hesitated, then nodded. "I've got everything set up. Once we're inside, I can access their security system and get us a visual on Lang's men." Joe pulled out the old shotgun he'd kept from his military days, checking it carefully. He hadn't used it in years, but it felt natural in his hands. "Stay close to me, Sam. We do this smart." They entered the warehouse quietly, slipping through a side door that Sam had hacked into earlier. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and oil, the shadows long and foreboding. The space was massive, with towering shelves stacked high with crates and boxes. Somewhere in this labyrinth, Lang was waiting. Joe could feel it. Sam's laptop pinged softly as he tapped into the security feed. "I've got eyes on them," Sam whispered. "They're in the back room. Looks like Lang brought a small crew." Joe nodded, his grip tightening on the shotgun. "Let's go." They moved through the warehouse, their footsteps barely audible against the concrete floor. Joe's senses were heightened, every noise, every flicker of movement registering in his mind. He wasn't just an old man anymore, he was a soldier, back on the battlefield. As they neared the back room, Joe motioned for Sam to stay low. They crept up to the doorway, peering inside. Just as Sam had said, Lang was there, standing in the center of the room, surrounded by a few of his men. Lang was tall, with a lean, angular face and cold, calculating eyes. He was dressed in a dark suit, looking completely out of place in the dingy warehouse. "You sure about this, boss?" one of Lang's men muttered, glancing around nervously. "It feels like a setup." Lang didn't flinch. "Harris won't risk a setup. Hez too smart for that. This is about revenge. He wants to face me man to man." Joe's lips curled into a grim smile. Lang had underestimated him, and that was going to be his downfall. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the warehouse, soft clattering that reverberated off the metal walls. Joe tensed, his instincts screaming danger. One of Lang's men spun around, gun raised, his finger hovering over the trigger. "What was that?" the man hissed. Lang's eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows. "Hez here." Joe knew it was now or never. With a swift motion, he stepped into the open, the shotgun raised and ready. "I'm here, Lang." Lang turned slowly, a smirk spreading across his face as he saw Joe standing in the doorway. "Joe Harris," Lang said, his voice smooth. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Joe didn't lower the shotgun. "This ends now." Lang chuckled softly. "Oh, I don't think so, Joe. You've been a thorn in my side for too long. But I have to admit, I respect your tenacity. You're a fighter. Always have been." Joe's eyes hardened. "I'm not here for your respect, Lang. I'm here for justice." Lang's smile faded, his eyes turning cold. "Justice? There's no justice, Joe. Not in this world. There's only power. And right now, I'm the one holding all the cards." Joe took a step forward, his voice low and deadly. "You don't hold anything anymore. Your accounts are frozen. Your network's been exposed. The FBI is closing in. You've lost." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Lang's face. His eyes darted to his men, then back to Joe. "You're bluffing." Joe didn't blink. "Check your phone." Lang hesitated, then pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. As he read the messages, his face paled. Joe could see the realization dawning on him. He was cornered. "You think this is over?" Lang hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won?" Joe's grip tightened on the shotgun. "It's over, Lang." Lang's eyes flicked to one of his men who reached for his gun. But before he could act, Joe fired. The shotgun blast echoed through the warehouse, the sound deafening. Lang's man crumpled to the floor, his gun clattering out of his hand. "Don't move," Joe growled, his eyes locked on Lang. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with tension, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. Lang's men looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Lang's face twisted with rage, but he didn't move. "I could kill you right now," Joe said, his voice cold and steady. "But that's not how this ends." Before Lang could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Joe's heart raced as he heard the unmistakable sound of unmarked cars pulling up outside the warehouse. McCaffrey's task force had arrived. Within minutes, the warehouse was swarming with federal agents. Lang's men were handcuffed and led out one by one, their heads hung low in defeat. Joe stood off to the side, watching as the operation unfolded, his shotgun still resting in his hands. McCaffrey appeared at Joe's side, his eyes filled with admiration. "You did it, Joe. We've got them all." Joe nodded, his face grim. "It's not over yet. Lang's still got allies out there. He won't be the last." McCaffrey clapped Joe on the shoulder. "Maybe not, but you've struck a blow that'll take them years to recover from. Riverside's safe now. You've done more than enough." Joe glanced over at Lang, who was being escorted out of the warehouse in handcuffs, his face twisted with anger and defeat. As their eyes met, Lang sneered, his voice dripping with hatred. "This isn't the end, Harris. There'll always be another." Joe's expression didn't change. "Maybe, but not today." As Lang was led away, the weight of everything settled over Joe. The fight had been long and hard, but in the end, they had won. He had protected his home, his family, and his town. But most importantly, he had proven that age and race didn't diminish his strength, his courage, or his resolve. The sun was rising as Joe and Sam walked out of the warehouse, the cool morning air filling their lungs. The battle was over, but Joe knew that the fight for justice was never truly done. There would always be more challenges, more threats. But as long as there were people willing to stand up, Like Joe and Sam, there was hope. "You ready to go home?" Sam asked, glancing at his grandfather. Joe smiled, a weary but satisfied smile. "Yeah, let's go home." Back at the house, the morning light streamed through the windows as Joe and Sam sat together on the porch, sipping coffee. The scars of the battle remained, both the physical damage to the property and the emotional toll of the fight. But there was a sense of peace now, a calm that had been absent for so long. Sam looked over at his grandfather, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You did it, Grandpa. You brought them down." Joe chuckled softly. "We did it, Sam. I couldn't have done it without you." As they sat in silence, watching the world wake up around them, Joe's heart swelled with pride. He had fought for what was right, just as he had all those years ago in the war. And though the battles were different now, the fight for justice never truly ended. "You think it's really over?" Sam asked quietly. Joe took a deep breath, looking out at the horizon. "For now, but there'll always be more to fight for." Sam nodded, understanding the weight of his grandfather's words. The fight wasn't just about defeating men like Lang. It was about standing up against injustice, no matter where it came from. And as long as there were people willing to fight, there was always hope. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over Riverside, Joe felt a sense of peace settle over him. The world was far from perfect, but for now, it was enough. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more thrilling tales of courage, justice, and redemption. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and share this story with friends and family who love powerful, inspiring stories like this one. Thanks for watching. Mia smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Yes, we did. And it's just the beginning." 1 year later, Hope Rising was no longer just a local initiative, it had become a model for affordable housing and community development across the country. Cities from coast to coast were reaching out to Jason and Mia for help in replicating the success of their project. What had started as a fight against discrimination had blossomed into a movement that was changing lives. Jason and Mia were recognized for their work at numerous events, receiving awards and honors from civil rights organizations, housing advocacy groups, and even government officials. But through it all, they remained focused on their mission to build communities where everyone had a chance to succeed. One evening, as they stood on the porch of their own home, watching the sunset over the city they loved, Jason wrapped his arm around Mia's waist, pulling her close. "Do you think we've done enough?" Jason asked, his voice soft. Mia smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We've done a lot, but there's always more to do." Jason chuckled. "That's what I thought you'd say." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear beyond the horizon. The journey had been long, and it hadn't always been easy, but they had made a difference, one that would be felt for generations to come. As they stood there, surrounded by the life they had built together, Jason and Mia knew that their legacy wasn't just about the homes they had helped create, or the communities they had strengthened. It was about the hope they had given to people who had been denied it for so long. And that hope would continue to rise. As Hope Rising developments flourished, Jason and Mia Carter found themselves at the forefront of a growing national movement for housing justice. Their model for affordable, inclusive communities was being studied, replicated, and praised in cities across the United States. Each new Hope Rising project represented not just houses, but the transformation of lives, proof that access to safe, affordable housing could rebuild neighborhoods and offer families a fresh start. But Jason and Mia knew they couldn't rest on their laurels. The battle against housing discrimination wasn't over. They had won key victories, but systemic issues still persisted, from redlining practices that kept people of color out of certain areas to predatory lending that disproportionately affected low-income communities. One day, as they sat in their office going over the latest reports on their newest development in Los Angeles, Mia glanced at Jason with a thoughtful look. "Do you ever feel like we're just putting out fires?" she asked quietly, tapping her pen against the table. Jason looked up, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Mia leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant. "We've done so much, Jason, but every time we make progress, it feels like we uncover more problems. There's still so much injustice baked into this system, so many barriers for people trying to get a foothold. We're helping, but we're not fixing the root of the issue. Jason nodded slowly, understanding what she meant. You're right. It's like we're treating the symptoms, not the disease. Mia sighed. We need to think bigger. Policy changes, financial reform, stronger protections for renters and buyers. We've proven that we can build communities, but how do we tackle the system itself? Jason considered her words carefully. He knew that Mia was right. They had fought hard to build Hope Rising, but the deeper problems, the discriminatory lending practices, unfair zoning laws, and lack of enforcement of fair housing regulations were all still in place. It wasn't enough to build new homes. They needed to change the framework that made housing inequality possible in the first place. Maybe it's time to take this fight to the next level, Jason said after a long pause. Mia raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? Jason leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with determination. We need to push for national housing reform. We've already made waves with the Fair Housing and Community Development Act, but we need to go further. We need to work with lawmakers, advocacy groups, and even financial institutions to address the systemic issues that keep people from accessing safe, affordable housing. We've got the platform. We can make real change. Mia smiled slightly, the spark of determination returning to her eyes. You're thinking we go beyond building houses. We go after the policies that create barriers in the first place. Jason nodded. Exactly. We've built something real with Hope Rising, but now we need to turn our attention to the policies that allow discrimination to persist. It's time to start changing the rules. A few weeks later, Jason and Mia found themselves back in Washington, D.C., meeting with lawmakers, civil rights groups, and housing advocates. They were no longer just real estate developers, they were advocates for national housing reform, using their success with Hope Rising as a blueprint for how communities across the country could be transformed. They began working closely with the National Fair Housing Alliance (NFHA) and other key organizations to draft comprehensive legislation aimed at addressing the root causes of housing inequality. The goal was clear, stronger federal enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, the elimination of discriminatory lending practices, and the creation of incentives for developers to build affordable housing in high-demand areas without pricing out low-income residents. Mia, always the strategist, led many of the meetings with lawmakers. She was clear, concise, and unflinchingly honest about the challenges people of color and low-income families faced when trying to secure housing. We've seen firsthand how discrimination plays out in the housing market, Mia said during one of the meetings with congressional leaders. It's not always overt, but it's there in the lending practices, in the zoning laws, in the way certain neighborhoods are systematically neglected. We need policies that protect people from these predatory practices, and we need real accountability for those who break the law. Jason, who had always been more comfortable with the hands-on side of the work, had grown into his role as an advocate. He spoke with passion, sharing stories from the families they had helped through Hope Rising and explaining why the work they were doing had to be scaled up on a national level. This isn't just about one city or one state, Jason said during a policy roundtable discussion. This is a national crisis. Families are being denied the right to stable housing because of who they are and where they come from. We've proven that it doesn't have to be this way, but we need the government to step up and ensure that no one is left behind. The discussions were intense, and the political landscape was challenging. While some lawmakers were eager to support the reforms, others were more hesitant, concerned about the costs or the potential pushback from the real estate and banking industries. But Jason and Mia were relentless. They knew that meaningful change was never easy, but they were prepared to fight for it. As their advocacy efforts continued, Jason and Mia remained deeply involved in their Hope Rising communities. They traveled to each new development as it opened, meeting with families, attending ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and ensuring that the communities were not only growing, but thriving. They had built something powerful, something that was making a real difference in people's lives. One afternoon, as they visited a newly completed development in Baltimore, Jason and Mia were approached by a young couple, Derek and Angela Thompson, who had just moved into one of the homes. "We just wanted to thank you," Derek said, shaking Jason's hand. "This place, it's everything we dreamed of. We didn't think we'd ever be able to own a home, especially not one like this. You've given us a chance we never thought we'd have." Angela, holding their young daughter in her arms, smiled warmly. "We're going to raise our daughter here, in a place where she can feel safe and proud of where she comes from. That means everything to us." Mia's heart swelled as she listened to them. These were the moments that made all the hard work worth it. "You're the reason we do this," Mia said softly. "You and your family, and everyone who deserves a fair shot at a good life." Derek nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You're changing the world, one house at a time." Despite the successes, Jason and Mia knew the road ahead was still long. The political climate was unpredictable, and they faced constant resistance from powerful developers and financial institutions that saw housing reform as a threat to their profits. Dale Walker, in particular, continued to wage his public campaign against the Carters, accusing them of pushing a radical agenda that would destroy the housing market as we know it. But Jason and Mia remained undeterred. They knew they were fighting for something bigger than profits. They were fighting for justice. And they had the support of countless families, advocates, and allies who were willing to stand with them. As the months passed, the push for federal housing reform gained traction. Lawmakers introduced the Housing Equity and Fair Access Act, a comprehensive bill that included many of the provisions Jason and Mia had been advocating for. It called for stricter enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, increased funding for affordable housing, and new regulations to ensure fair lending practices. The bill faced opposition from some members of Congress and powerful lobbyists, but the tide of public opinion was turning. Jason and Mia's story had captured the nation's attention, and the grassroots movement they had helped inspire was growing stronger every day. In a nationally televised hearing, Mia once again took the stage, speaking directly to the American people. "This isn't just about housing," Mia said, her voice steady but impassioned. "This is about justice. It's about giving every family the opportunity to build a life, to build wealth, to raise their children in a place where they feel safe and valued. We cannot continue to allow discriminatory practices to keep people locked out of the American dream. We must act now, and we must act together." The hearing was a turning point. In the weeks that followed, support for the bill grew, and the media coverage surrounding the Carters' work intensified. More lawmakers began to publicly endorse the legislation, and housing advocacy groups ramped up their efforts to push it through Congress. By the end of the year, the Housing Equity and Fair Access Act passed both houses of Congress and was signed into law by the President. It was a historic moment, and Jason and Mia were there to witness it, standing alongside lawmakers and advocates who had fought tirelessly for change. As they stood on the steps of the Capitol, watching as the President signed the bill into law, Jason felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was what they had been fighting for all along, not just for themselves, but for the countless families who would benefit from the changes they had helped bring about. Mia smiled, her eyes filled with pride as she looked at Jason. "We did it!" Jason nodded, wrapping his arm around her. "Yeah, we really did." But Mia, ever the visionary, wasn't ready to rest just yet. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We've changed the law, but now we need to make sure it's enforced." Jason chuckled softly. "You never stop, do you?" Mia grinned. "Not when there's still work to be done." Years later, Jason and Mia Carter stood at the entrance of their latest hope-rising development in New Orleans. The community, named Carter Village, had become a beacon of hope for the city, providing affordable housing, job training programs, and educational opportunities for its residents. It was the largest development they had ever built, and it represented everything they had worked for. As they walked through the bustling neighborhood, they were greeted by familiar faces, residents who had found new beginnings in Carter Village. families who had once been denied a place to call home but were now thriving. The journey had been long, and it hadn't always been easy, but Jason and Mia knew that they had made a lasting impact. They had fought for justice, and they had won one law, one community, one family at a time. Standing on the edge of the playground, watching children laugh and play, Jason turned to Mia, a content smile on his face. "We've built something incredible," he said softly. Mia nodded, her heart full. "We have, and it's going to last." Jason looked out at the horizon, the sun setting over the rooftops of the homes they had helped create. This is what it's all about, isn't it?" Mia smiled, leaning into him. "Yes, it is." They stood there, hand in hand, knowing that they had left a legacy of hope and change. Their fight for housing justice wasn't over, but they had come so far, and the future was brighter than ever. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about inspiring journeys, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on the latest stories of change, justice, and hope. Subscribe today and join us as we continue to explore stories that make a difference. The company had to choose a side. Either it stood for the values of fairness and inclusion, or it would continue to enable discriminatory practices. "We're prepared to take this to court," Olivia said, her tone firm. "But we'd prefer to resolve this internally, with full accountability and corrective action." Jenna Riley's actions have been damaging to both the company and its passengers. It's time for her to take responsibility. Jenna's lawyer, Robert, leaned forward, his voice firm but clearly on the defensive. "Ms. Brooks, Miss Carter, I think we can all agree that this situation has been difficult for everyone involved. But let's not lose sight of the fact that Jenna was acting within her role as a flight attendant, trying to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers." Ava cut him off again, her patience wearing thin. "No, Mr. Marston, this isn't about safety or comfort. This is about respect, about human dignity, and the fact that you're still trying to frame it otherwise tells me you don't understand the gravity of what's happening here." She turned her gaze back to Jenna, her voice softening but still carrying the weight of her conviction. Jenna's face was tense, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair. Ava could see the internal battle playing out in her eyes, the fear of losing everything she had worked for, the stubbornness of not wanting to admit fault, and perhaps, just beneath the surface, the faint flicker of remorse. Jenna's lawyer leaned in to whisper something to her, but Ava could see that the real struggle was happening within Jenna herself. After what felt like an eternity, Jenna finally spoke, her voice low and unsteady. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Jenna said, her eyes downcast. "I was just trying to do my job." Ava didn't respond immediately, allowing Jenna to continue. "I've worked for this airline for years, and I always thought I was doing the right thing," Jenna said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I see now that I wasn't thinking about how my actions affected people. I was wrong." Ava remained silent, waiting. "Really bad." Jenna looked up, meeting Ava's eyes for the first time. "I'm sorry, Ava. I really am. I didn't see it before, but I do now, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Ava nodded, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Jenna's apology was far from perfect, and there was still a long road ahead. But it was a start, a necessary step toward accountability and healing. "We'll discuss the terms of a resolution," Olivia said, her voice cutting through the silence. "But we expect full cooperation moving forward. This isn't just about closing the case, it's about making sure that this never happens again." Jenna nodded, her shoulders slumping slightly as the reality of the situation sank in. Her lawyer remained quiet, clearly aware that the fight had shifted in Ava's favor. Ava glanced at David and the other executives, who were still processing the gravity of what had just unfolded. There was no going back now. The company had reached a crossroads, and Ava had made it clear which path they would be taking. "This isn't the end," Ava said quietly, addressing the room. "It's the beginning of something better. We're going to rebuild this company from the ground up, and that starts with owning our mistakes and making real changes." The meeting adjourned shortly after, and as the others filed out of the room, Ava remained seated for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. It wasn't victory, not yet. There was still so much work to be done. but it was a step forward. A step toward creating a culture that truly reflected the values she had always believed in. As Olivia packed up the last of the documents, she looked over at Ava, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You did it, Ava. We're moving in the right direction." Ava exhaled slowly, nodding. "We are, but we're not done yet." Ava Brooks sat in the quiet of her office, watching the early morning light filter through the glass windows. The confrontation with Jenna Riley had been a turning point, but now the real work began, the aftermath. The company was poised on the edge of a transformation, and Ava could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her personal vindication. It was about changing an entire system. The previous week had been a whirlwind of meetings and difficult conversations. Jenna's public apology, though far from perfect, had sent ripples through the airline. For the first time, employees were openly talking about the culture that had silently permeated the company for years. Some were uncomfortable with the shift, while others, particularly those who had quietly suffered, began to feel hopeful that real change was coming. Ava's phone buzzed on her desk, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Olivia. "Court ruled in our favor. Formal settlement agreement being drafted. We can discuss terms today." Ava's heart skipped a beat. They had won. After months of legal battles, emotional strain, and seemingly endless meetings, the court had ruled in their favor. Jenna Riley would face formal consequences for her actions, and the airline would be held accountable for its role in allowing discriminatory behavior to persist. But more importantly, this legal victory meant that the reforms Ava had been pushing for could no longer be brushed aside. Ava leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment as the weight of the news settled in. It wasn't just about the legal victory, it was about the validation of everything she had fought for. The truth had been laid bare, and now the company had no choice but to move forward with the comprehensive changes she had envisioned. Later that afternoon, Ava and Olivia met with the airline's legal and executive teams to finalize the terms of the settlement. David Harrington, the chief operating officer, sat across from them, looking more composed than he had in previous weeks. Ava could sense that the reality of the situation had finally sunk in for him. The time for resistance had passed. It was time to rebuild. Olivia, ever the professional, laid out the terms in a calm, precise manner. As part of the settlement, the airline will implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, starting at the executive level and extending to every member of staff, from flight attendants to ground crew. David nodded, though his expression remained neutral. Ava could tell he still harbored some concerns about the financial impact of the reforms, but he also understood that there was no turning back. "We'll also be reviewing the complaint process," Olivia continued. "Every report of discrimination or mistreatment will be thoroughly investigated, and no complaints will be dismissed without a full review by an independent committee." David shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes meeting Ava's. "Ava, you know this isn't going to be easy. Implementing these changes across the entire company will take time and resources." Ava nodded, her voice steady. "I understand that, David. But doing the right thing isn't always easy. This is about more than just protecting the company from legal consequences. It's about creating a culture where everyone is treated with respect, where every passenger and employee feels safe and valued." David sighed but nodded in agreement. "You're right. We should have addressed this a long time ago." Olivia continued with the rest of the terms. Jenna Riley would be placed on leave, pending further investigation, and the company would make a public commitment to addressing systemic discrimination. The airline would also provide compensation to affected employees and passengers who had come forward with complaints. When the meeting concluded, Ava felt a sense of closure beginning to take root. It wasn't about punishment or retribution. This was about making sure that what had happened to her and to others like her would never happen again. In the days that followed, the news of the settlement broke, sparking a media frenzy. Headlines splashed across newspapers and news sites. "Airline settles in discrimination case, major reforms on the way." CEO Ava Brooks leads fight for corporate accountability. Airline faces reckoning after racial discrimination lawsuit. For the first time, Ava wasn't anxious about the media attention. This was the story she wanted out there, a story about transformation, about owning up to mistakes and pushing for a better future. The narrative had shifted from a scandal to one of accountability and growth. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Messages flooded in from across the world, customers, employees, and even people who had never flown with the airline, thanking Ava for standing up, for refusing to let the issue be swept under the rug. Some shared their own stories of being mistreated or overlooked, inspired by Ava's determination to fight back. But Ava's focus was already on the future. The reforms were being rolled out across the company, starting with the senior leadership team. The diversity and inclusion training sessions were designed not just as a formality, but as a real opportunity for change. The program would include practical workshops where employees would learn how their unconscious biases could affect their work and how to create a more inclusive environment for all passengers. Ava personally oversaw the training for the executive team, determined to ensure that the changes started at the top. She stood at the front of the room, addressing the group of senior leaders, some of whom had been with the company since its inception. "This is where the real work begins," Ava said, her voice strong but filled with purpose. "It's not enough to implement policies. We have to live them. We have to show our employees, our customers, and the world that we're committed to being better." There were murmurs of agreement around the room, but Ava knew that words were only the beginning. Action was what mattered now. Real change required commitment, and she was prepared to lead that charge. A few weeks later, as the dust settled and the company began to adjust to the new changes, Ava found herself sitting in her office once again, looking out at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the buildings. The long journey, filled with emotional highs and lows, was finally beginning to pay off. Her phone buzzed with a message from Olivia: "Training sessions going well. Staff feedback is positive so far. We're making progress." Ava smiled, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. The path had been difficult, but every step had been worth it. The culture of the airline was shifting, little by little, toward one of fairness and respect. There was still much work to be done, but the foundation had been laid. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Christine Larkin, the former flight attendant who had come forward with her testimony. She had recently rejoined the airline in a new role, part of the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. "Ava, do you have a minute?" Christine asked, stepping into the office. "Of course," Ava replied, motioning for her to sit. Christine smiled, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and pride. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. I never thought I'd have the courage to speak up, but you made that possible. And now things are really changing." Ava's smile widened. "You don't have to thank me, Christine. You're the one who had the courage to come forward. This change, it's because of all of us." Christine nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "I've been talking to some of the newer flight attendants, and they're already noticing a difference. People are more aware, more mindful of how they treat passengers. It's a start, but it's a good one." Ava leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. The airline was on the path to becoming the company she had always envisioned, a place where everyone, regardless of who they were or what they looked like, was treated with dignity and respect. "We've come a long way," Ava said softly, "but we're not done yet." Christine nodded in agreement. "No, we're not. But at least now, we're moving in the right direction." Months had passed since the settlement was finalized, and the airline was slowly but surely transforming. The diversity and inclusion initiatives had expanded beyond training sessions to include mentorship programs, employee resource groups, and a new system for handling complaints that ensured every issue was addressed with transparency and accountability. Ava had made sure to stay deeply involved in the process, regularly meeting with staff and listening to their feedback. She knew that real change wasn't something that could be mandated from the top. It had to be cultivated from within, nurtured by every employee. On one particular morning, Ava found herself on a flight, this time as a passenger, seated in first class once again. But this flight felt different. The atmosphere was lighter, the staff friendlier. As she looked around, she noticed something she hadn't seen on her previous flights: diversity. The crew was made up of people from various backgrounds, and the passengers reflected the same diversity. A flight attendant approached her, smiling warmly. "Ms. Brooks, can I get you anything?" Ava smiled back, feeling a sense of pride in how far the company had come. "Just some water, thank you." As the flight attendant walked away, Ava leaned back in her seat, gazing out the window at the clouds rolling by. The fight had been long and hard, but the reward was clear: a company that had embraced change, that had grown stronger because of it. Ava knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always more work to be done. But for now, she could rest easy, knowing that she had made a real difference, not just for herself, but for countless others. As the plane soared through the sky, Ava felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The airline she had built was finally living up to the vision she had always dreamed of, one where everyone had a seat at the table, and everyone was treated with the respect they deserved. And in that moment, Ava knew that she had truly won. Ava Brooks never sought recognition. In her heart, she had always believed that real change didn't need the spotlight, it needed dedication, persistence, and the courage to stand up when it mattered most. As the months turned into a year since the settlement, her life had settled into a new rhythm. The airline had undergone a transformation that extended beyond its policies. It had reshaped its identity. And while Ava felt a deep sense of accomplishment, she knew there was still more to be done. One crisp autumn morning, Ava was invited to speak at a national conference on corporate responsibility and diversity. The event had drawn leaders from various industries, eager to discuss how businesses could not only survive, but thrive by fostering inclusive environments. As Ava stood backstage, reviewing her notes, she reflected on how far she had come and how far the company had come, thanks to the battle she had fought. "Ava, you're up in 5, Olivia said, coming up beside her with a reassuring smile. Ava nodded, feeling a familiar surge of energy as she prepared to step into the limelight. She wasn't one for grand speeches, but this was different. This was a moment where she could share her story and inspire others to take the same steps, to hold their own companies accountable, and foster a culture where everyone felt valued. As the conference host introduced her, Ava took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The bright lights of the auditorium illuminated the hundreds of faces watching her intently, but she wasn't nervous. She was ready. "Good morning," Ava began, her voice strong yet warm. "Thank you for having me here today. I want to start by saying that change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because one person decides it's time. It happens when a collective force within a company, a community, or a society says enough is enough." The audience was silent, their attention fixed on Ava as she continued. "A little over a year ago, I stood in the same position many of you are in, now leading a company, grappling with complex issues, and faced with a decision that would define not just my business, but who I was as a leader. The story many of you know began with a single flight, a flight where I, a black woman, a CEO, was made to feel like I didn't belong in a seat I had rightfully paid for. But that flight was just the catalyst." Ava paused, letting the weight of her words settle in. "What followed was a journey of accountability, one where I and my team had to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the company I had built had allowed a toxic culture to take root. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to step back, moments when I questioned whether the fight was worth it. But it was worth it. Because it wasn't just about me, it was about every person who had ever felt marginalized, dismissed, or disrespected because of who they were or how they looked." The audience remained silent, hanging on to every word. The auditorium was packed, the hum of conversation filling the air as Marcus stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak. "We've implemented diversity and inclusion training across every level of our company, restructured our complaint processes to ensure that no voice goes unheard, and fostered an environment where our employees and passengers know that they are valued. But I'm not here to talk about our success. I'm here to challenge you all to look within your own organizations. Because the truth is, this issue isn't isolated to one company, one industry, or one country. A few heads nodded in agreement. Ava could feel the connection she was building with the room. This isn't just about doing what's good for business, though. Let me assure you, it is good for business. It's about doing what's right. It's about standing for something, even when it's difficult, even when it's uncomfortable. As leaders, we have the power to create environments where everyone, regardless of race, gender, background, or status, feels like they belong. Ava took another breath, softening her tone as she prepared to close. It took one moment, one incident, to start the change within my company. But it took the commitment of many, my legal team, my employees, my fellow leaders, to see that change through. I ask each of you today to go back to your organizations and ask yourself, what kind of culture am I building? And is it one where every person feels respected? They had lived it too. The lights dimmed slightly, and the conference host returned to the stage, thanking Ava for her powerful words. As she walked off stage, Olivia was there to greet her, smiling with pride. "You were incredible," Olivia said, giving Ava a light pat on the back. "You might not love public speaking, but you have a gift for it." Ava laughed softly. "I just spoke from the heart. Hopefully, it makes a difference." Olivia nodded. "It will. Believe me, it will." Back at the office, life had settled into a new normal. Ava continued to oversee the company's transformation, but she had also shifted her focus to broader initiatives, helping other businesses implement the same reforms she had championed within her airline. Her work was no longer confined to her own company. She had become a voice for change across industries, a role model for other leaders who wanted to create inclusive environments. A few days after the conference, Ava received an unexpected email. It was from Jenna Riley. "Ava, I hope this message finds you well. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened over the past year. It's taken me a long time to process, but I wanted to reach out to thank you. Not for what happened, but for showing me what accountability looks like. I've been doing a lot of reflecting, and I've started working on myself. I've enrolled in a course on cultural sensitivity and inclusion, and am taking steps to understand how my actions affected you and others. I realize now that I was part of the problem, and for that, I am truly sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm committed to becoming better. I hope that in time, I can be part of the solution. Thank you again, Jenna." Ava read the email twice, absorbing Jenna's words. It was clear that Jenna had gone through her own journey of self-reflection, a journey Ava had never expected her to take. Ava had already moved past the pain of that flight, but reading Jenna's message gave her a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about knowing that change, real change, was possible, even for those who had been part of the problem. Ava replied simply, "I appreciate your message, Jenna. Wishing you the best on your journey." As the months rolled on, Ava's work continued to expand. She partnered with nonprofits focused on workplace diversity, spoke at universities, and even sat down with government officials to discuss policies that would encourage corporate accountability. Her airline had become a model for other companies looking to reform their practices, and Ava had become a leader not just in business, but in the fight for social justice. One evening, as she sat in her penthouse apartment, sipping tea and looking out at the city skyline, Ava felt a profound sense of peace. She had been through so much, rising from humble beginnings, building a business empire, and fighting against the injustices that had tried to hold her back. But she hadn't just fought for herself. She had fought for something larger, something that would outlast her. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Olivia. "We're receiving another award for our diversity initiatives. Congratulations, Ava. Your work is being recognized everywhere." Ava smiled softly, her heart full. She had never sought the accolades, but knowing that her efforts were making a difference filled her with pride. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Ava felt that she had truly found her purpose. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a change maker, someone who had taken the pain of her experiences and turned it into something powerful, something that would continue to ripple through the world long after her work was done. As Ava gazed out at the lights of the city, she whispered softly to herself, thinking of her late mother's words, "Keep going, Ava. Don't give up." And she wouldn't. Not ever. Ava Brooks' journey had taken her to places she never thought possible. The airline's transformation was well underway, and her influence had grown beyond the company she founded. She had become a national figure and advocate for corporate accountability, a voice for inclusion, and a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. But for Ava, the work wasn't finished. In the months following the conference, Ava received requests to speak at panels, consult with other businesses, and even participate in discussions with lawmakers on the broader implications of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. She was excited, but also keenly aware that real change required more than just speeches, it required concrete action. One of the organizations that had been watching Ava's work closely was a leading civil rights group, the National Equity Initiative. Their mission was to promote systemic reforms in companies across the country, and they saw Ava as the ideal partner to help push forward a major campaign that would aim to enforce stronger policies around corporate discrimination. Ava received a personal invitation from the organization's president, Dr. Teresa Gardner, to meet and discuss how they could collaborate. Ava walked into the sleek offices of the National Equity Initiative, greeted warmly by Dr. Gardner herself. Teresa was a formidable woman, known for her deep knowledge of civil rights law and her relentless pursuit of justice. She had spent decades in the fight for racial and gender equality and had a reputation for creating long-lasting impact. "It's such a pleasure to finally meet you, Ava," Teresa said with a wide smile, shaking Ava's hand. "I've followed your journey with great admiration." "The pleasure is mine, Dr. Gardner," Ava replied, grateful for the opportunity. "I've been inspired by the work you've done. I think we can do something really meaningful together." They sat down in a bright conference room, its walls lined with framed photos of civil rights leaders. Teresa wasted no time diving into the heart of their meeting. "Ava, your work with the airline has set a precedent. You've demonstrated that one person can make a difference, and that corporate culture can be transformed. What we're trying to do is take that model and make it applicable to every industry. We need businesses across the country to adopt these reforms, not just because it's good PR, but because it's necessary for a just society." Ava nodded, completely in sync with the vision. "I agree. The changes we made at the airline are just the beginning. There are so many companies that have deep-rooted problems, and those won't be fixed by surface-level training sessions. It's going to take systemic reform." Teresa smiled, clearly pleased with Ava's passion. "Exactly. That's why we want you to help lead our new initiative. We're calling it the Corporate Accountability Project, or CAP. The goal is to work directly with CEOs, HR departments, and government officials to draft industry-wide guidelines for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to create a blueprint that businesses across the country can follow." Ava's heart quickened with excitement. This was what she had been working toward all along, a chance to take her personal fight and expand it on a national level. "I'm in," she said without hesitation. "I want to be part of this." That's the spirit. The Corporate Accountability Project gained momentum quickly, attracting interest from major corporations, lawmakers, and nonprofit organizations alike. Ava's role involved meeting with corporate leaders, sharing her own experiences, and helping them understand the importance of deep, structural change. One of her first major meetings was with Dan Matthews, the CEO of a major tech company that had been facing criticism for its lack of diversity in leadership. The company had struggled to attract and retain employees from marginalized backgrounds, and its internal culture had been called into question after several high-profile resignations. Dan greeted Ava warmly when she arrived at the tech company's headquarters, but she could tell that he was nervous. Like many CEOs, he was concerned about how the public perceived his company and how the changes Ava was suggesting might affect his bottom line. "Look, Ava," Dan began as they sat down, "I get it. diversity is important and we've made some efforts, but it's hard. Our industry moves fast, and sometimes it feels like we don't have the luxury of focusing on these kinds of initiatives when we're just trying to stay competitive." Ava smiled, understanding the pressure Dan was under. But she wasn't going to let him off the hook. "Dan, I know you're trying to run a successful business. People look at me differently because of how I look, because of where my family is from." Dan's eyes flickered, and Ava could see that her words were resonating. She leaned in, her voice calm but firm. "You don't have to choose between success and diversity. In fact, the two go hand in hand. The more diverse perspectives you have in the room, the more innovative your company will be. But you have to be willing to do the work, real, meaningful work. And that starts with leadership. It starts with you." Dan sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You're right. I know you're right. I guess I need help figuring out how to get there." Ava smiled, feeling the familiar sense of satisfaction that came with knowing she was making a difference. "That's why I'm here." The Corporate Accountability Project began gaining traction in other industries as well: finance, healthcare, retail. Ava worked tirelessly with CEOs and executives to create individualized plans that would foster diversity and inclusion within their ranks. Each company had its own challenges, but Ava's approach was always the same: be direct, be honest, and be committed to change. Meanwhile, Ava's airline continued to thrive. The changes she had implemented were yielding positive results, with employee satisfaction at an all-time high and passenger complaint related to discrimination significantly reduced. The company's reputation had not only recovered, but had been strengthened by its commitment to inclusivity. Investors, once wary of the costs of reform, were now praising the airline's progressive stance and seeing the financial benefits of a happy, engaged workforce. Ava's schedule was relentless, but the rewards were undeniable. She had become more than just a CEO. She was a symbol of corporate reform, a leader who had turned her personal experience into a national movement. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Ava returned to her office and found an invitation waiting for her on her desk. It was from the White House. She opened the elegant envelope and read the message inside. "Dear Ms. Brooks, the President of the United States requests the honor of your presence at a roundtable discussion on corporate diversity and inclusion to be held at the White House next month. Your leadership and contributions to this important issue have made a significant impact, and we would be honored to have your voice in this conversation." Ava sat down, stunned. She had never imagined that her journey would take her this far. From fighting a single battle on a flight to being invited to the White House to discuss national policies on corporate accountability, it was more than she had ever dreamed of. As she sat in the quiet of her office, the weight of the invitation settled in. This was no longer just about her airline, or even about the companies she had worked with through the Corporate Accountability Project. This was about shaping the future of the entire country's approach to diversity, inclusion, and fairness in the workplace. Ava picked up the phone and called Olivia. "You're not going to believe this," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "I just got invited to the White House." As Ava walked out of her office that day, the sun shining brightly above her, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had spent her life fighting for what she believed in, and now she could see the fruits of that labor everywhere she looked. Her legacy wasn't just in the companies she had transformed, or the policies she had helped implement. It was in the lives she had touched, the people who had found their voices, who had broken through barriers, and who were now carrying the torch forward. Ava smiled as she stepped into the bustling street, knowing that her work would live on through the countless leaders she had inspired. This was her legacy, a world where everyone had the opportunity to thrive, where diversity was celebrated, and where accountability was the foundation of every successful business. And even though the work was far from over, Ava knew that she had made a lasting difference. If you've been inspired by Ava's journey and want to hear more stories about leadership, accountability, and creating positive change in the world, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can continue spreading the message of inclusion and fairness, and help build a world where everyone has the opportunity to succeed. Stay tuned for more stories of transformation and leadership, because real change begins with us. Hit that subscribe button and don't miss out on the next chapter of this incredible journey. It's about a system that has been built to ignore the needs of people of color. It's about a culture that allows bias to go unchecked, because it's easier to look the other way. The audience was silent, their attention fully on Marcus. "But we can change that," he continued. "We've seen it happen before. When we come together, when we hold institutions accountable, we can make real progress. But it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take sustained effort, and it's going to take all of us." When Marcus finished his speech, the applause was thunderous. He had become more than just a survivor of discrimination. He was now a leader in the fight to dismantle the very systems that had harmed him, and so many others. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his hotel room, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. From that first encounter with Gary Matthews at Green Hill Pharmacy to standing in front of national leaders calling for systemic reform, his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. He thought about the people he had met along the way: Sarah, Darren, Olivia Reed, the other victims who had come forward to share their stories. Each of them had played a part in this fight, and each of them had helped to push the needle of justice forward, even if just a little. Marcus pulled out his notebook, a habit he had developed during the lawsuit, where he jotted down thoughts and reflections. He opened to a blank page and began to write. "Change is slow, but it's happening. Every fight, every voice, every story, it all adds up. I never wanted to be the face of anything, but now that I'm here, I can't turn back. We can't turn back. The fight for justice is hard, but it's the only fight worth having." He closed the notebook, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt at peace with where it was leading him. The more Marcus involved himself in national advocacy, the more he realized that systemic change required collaboration between different sectors of society. The fight for racial justice in healthcare couldn't be won by lawsuits alone, needed the engagement of doctors, nurses, policymakers, and, most importantly, the communities that had been most affected. One of the most significant moments in Marcus' journey came when he was invited to attend a summit on healthcare reform hosted by the American Medical Association, AMA. Healthcare leaders from across the country were gathering to discuss how to address racial disparities in patient care, and Marcus had been asked to participate in a panel alongside healthcare professionals and other advocates. Walking into the Grand Conference Hall in Chicago, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of both awe and apprehension. The stakes felt higher than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his own justice anymore, he was pushing for a transformation of the entire healthcare system. And now he would be standing alongside some of the most powerful voices in the field. As the panel discussion began, Marcus listened carefully to the doctors and policy experts who spoke before him. They talked about the data, the studies that showed how patients of color were less likely to receive adequate care, how their pain was often underestimated, how their symptoms were dismissed. But what was missing from the conversation, Marcus realized, was the human side, the lived experiences of the people who had suffered because of these biases. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood and took a deep breath. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, and once again, that familiar nervousness crept up his spine. But he had learned to harness that feeling. "I've heard a lot of great ideas here today," Marcus began, his voice steady but passionate. "But we can't forget the people who live this every day. The people who walk into clinics and hospitals and pharmacies and feel like they're not being seen. I'm not a doctor, but I am someone who has lived through this. I've been treated like a criminal for doing nothing more than asking for the same treatment anyone else would get. And that experience isn't unique to me." The room was silent, and Marcus could see that his words were hitting their mark. "We can talk about policy and data all day," Marcus continued, "but if we don't acknowledge the real stories, the real people behind those numbers, we'll never get anywhere. What we need is to build bridges between healthcare providers and the communities they serve, between those in power and those who've been silenced. We need empathy, we need understanding, and we need accountability. The applause that followed was polite but genuine. As Marcus sat down, he knew that the fight ahead would be just as tough as the battles he'd already fought. But he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. He was working with people who shared his vision for a better, more equitable future. No matter how far his fight took him, he always came back home. On one of his returns to Riverton, Marcus was surprised to see just how much had changed in the years since his court victory. The small town had started its own conversations about racism, spearheaded by local leaders and community groups. People who had once stayed silent about their own experiences were now speaking up, sharing their stories in town hall meetings and community forums. One of the most encouraging developments was that Green Hill Pharmacy, under new management, had implemented a comprehensive anti-bias training program for its employees. Gary Matthews was long gone, but the pharmacy had taken steps to rebuild trust with the community. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. One afternoon, as Marcus strolled through downtown Riverton, he saw Olivia Reed, the reporter who had first written his story. She was sitting outside a cafe, sipping a coffee and reading a book. "Marcus," Olivia called, waving him over. "How's the big-time advocate?" Marcus smiled as he approached her table. "I wouldn't call it that," he said, sitting down. "I'm just trying to do my part." "Don't be modest," Olivia said, her eyes twinkling. "You've done more than just your part. People around here are starting to pay attention. You've made a real difference." Marcus glanced down the street, where people moved about their day as if nothing had changed. But he knew better. Underneath the surface, Riverton had shifted. "I just hope we can keep the momentum going," he said. "It's easy to start these conversations, but keeping them alive, that's the hard part." Olivia nodded. "True, but look at where we were a year ago. No one in this town was even talking about racial bias, let alone doing something about it. And now people are aware. They're engaged. That's because of you." Marcus smiled, grateful for her words. "I guess you're right. I miss him." Marcus paused, considering the question. He had been so focused on the immediate battles, the lawsuit, the advocacy work, that he hadn't had much time to think about the future. But now, as things began to settle, he realized he had a new path ahead of him. "I think I'm going to keep teaching," Marcus said. "But I also want to keep working on this issue, both here in Riverton and nationally. There's so much more to be done, and I want to be a part of it." Olivia smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that." As the months went on, Marcus continued to split his time between his teaching job in Riverton and his advocacy work on a broader scale. But more and more, he found himself drawn to the local community, the place where it had all started. He began working closely with local organizers, helping to create programs that addressed racial inequality in all aspects of Riverton life, not just healthcare, but education, law enforcement, and local businesses. The goal was to create a town where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel safe and respected. One of the most important initiatives Marcus helped launch was a youth mentorship program, pairing local high school students with mentors who could provide guidance and support. Many of these students, particularly those from marginalized communities, lacked access to the resources and opportunities they needed to succeed. Marcus saw the program as a way to give back to the community that had shaped him and to invest in the next generation. During one of the program's mentorship sessions, Marcus sat with a group of students, listening as they shared their thoughts on race, opportunity, and the future. One young man, a quiet kid named Jamal, raised his hand. "Mr. James," Jamal began hesitantly, "I know you went through a lot with that case at Green Hill. Do you ever feel like you made the right choice? Like, was it worth it?" The question took Marcus by surprise, but after a moment, he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "It was hard, and there were times when I doubted myself. But in the end, I know I did the right thing." The foundation became a beacon of hope for those who needed it most, a testament to Tom's legacy and to the power of redemption. It's uncomfortable and it's scary, but if we don't stand up for ourselves and for others, nothing ever changes. Jamal looked thoughtful, nodding as he absorbed Marcus' words. That's why we're all here today, Marcus continued, looking around at the students. You all have the power to make a difference. It might not seem like it now, but one day, when you're faced with a choice to stand up or stay silent, you'll know what to do. The room was quiet, but Marcus could see the impact his words had on the students. They were listening. They were learning. And that was the most important thing. As Marcus reflected on everything he had accomplished, the lawsuit, the advocacy, the mentorship program, he realized that his life had taken on a new purpose. He was no longer just a teacher in a small town, he was a leader, an advocate, and a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. But through it all, Marcus remained humble. He knew that the fight for justice was far from over, and that every victory was just one step in a much larger journey. There would always be more to do, more battles to fight, more voices to uplift. One evening, as he sat on his front porch, watching the sun set over Riverton, Marcus allowed himself a moment of peace. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. He thought about his mother, Elaine, who had worried so much about him during the lawsuit, and about Darren, who had stood by his side through every step of the process. He thought about Sarah Collins, who had believed in him even when he doubted himself. And he thought about the countless people across the country who had supported him, who had shared their own stories, and who had inspired him to keep going. This was just the beginning. The fight for racial justice, for equality, for a better world, it was long, difficult, and full of setbacks. But Marcus James was ready, and with that thought, he stood up, ready to face the new day ahead. The sun dipped below the horizon as Marcus stood on his porch, taking in the quiet evening. Riverton was still the same small town he had always known, but for him, it felt different now. His life had been transformed by the journey he had taken, a journey he hadn't asked for but had embraced when it mattered most. The court victory against Green Hill Pharmacy had been more than just a personal triumph, it had been a wake-up call for the town, and for many others across the country. People were beginning to understand that racism wasn't always loud and obvious sometimes. It was hidden in plain sight, woven into the everyday interactions that shaped people's lives. As Marcus reflected on the past year, he knew that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. There were still many more battles to come, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had seen firsthand the power of speaking up, of refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. And he wasn't done yet. The youth mentorship program was thriving, giving young people in Riverton the tools and guidance they needed to navigate a world that wasn't always fair. His advocacy work had grown beyond the town's borders, reaching a national audience that was eager for change. And through it all, Marcus remained grounded in his core belief that standing up for what was right was always worth the cost. His phone buzzed with a new message from Darren. "You ready for tomorrow? Big rally in the city." Marcus smiled. There was always something on the horizon, always another step to take. He typed back, "I'll be there. Let's keep this going." Closing the door behind him, Marcus sat down at his kitchen table, pulling out his notebook and jotting down a few thoughts. He knew that the fight for equality and justice would require persistence and courage, but he was ready for whatever came next. He was more than just a teacher, no, he was a voice for those who had been unheard for too long, and he wasn't going to stop until real change had been achieved. With a deep breath, Marcus closed the notebook, stood up, and walked toward the future with a quiet but determined resolve. Thank you for reading Marcus' Journey. If you've enjoyed this story and want to be part of more inspiring journeys and creative stories, be sure to hit the subscribe button below to stay updated. Your support helps keep these stories going. As part of this foundation, part of this family, and that will never change. Rachel nodded, her eyes full of gratitude and love. "I'm glad we found our way back to each other, Mary. I'm glad we built this together." Mary's throat tightened with emotion. "So am I," she whispered. "It's the greatest gift I've ever been given." As the evening grew darker and the park began to empty, David ran over to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Grandma, Mom," he called, waving from across the field. "We're going to get ice cream. Want to come?" Rachel laughed and shook her head. You go ahead, sweetie. We'll catch up in a bit. David grinned and gave them a thumbs up before running off with his friends, leaving Mary and Rachel alone on the bench, the quiet of the evening settling around them. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the sky turn from orange to pink to deep purple. The oak tree they had planted for Tom stood tall and strong nearby, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. It had grown so much over the years, just like their family, steady, resilient, and rooted in love. After a long moment, Rachel broke the silence, her voice thoughtful. I've been thinking about the future, she said quietly. Mary glanced at her, sensing the seriousness in Rachel's tone. What about it? Rachel smiled faintly. About what's next for the foundation, for David. For all of us. Mary listened intently, knowing that Rachel's words held the weight of something important. I've been thinking, Rachel continued, that maybe it's time for David to start thinking about college. He's been talking a lot about studying social work, or maybe even education. He wants to help kids, just like the foundation does. Mary's heart swelled with pride. That's wonderful, she said, her voice full of warmth. He's got such a big heart, just like Tom. Rachel nodded. He does, and I think he's ready for the next step. But I also think it's time for me to take a step back from the foundation. I've been running things for a long time, and while I love it, I want to focus more on David and what comes next for him. Mary's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, but as she looked at Rachel, she saw the wisdom in her words. Rachel had poured her heart and soul into the foundation for years, and now it was time for her to shift her focus. David was growing up, and Rachel wanted to be there for him as he took on the challenges of adulthood. I understand, Mary said softly. But what about the foundation? You've been the heart of it. Rachel smiled warmly. The foundation has a life of its own now. We've built something that can carry on without us being there every day. And besides, he'll still be involved, just not as much as before. Mary nodded, feeling a mixture of sadness and understanding. The foundation had been their joint effort, a way to honor Tom's memory and give back to the community. But now, it was time for things to change, for the next generation to step up and take the reins. Who do you think will take over? Mary asked, her curiosity piqued. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then smiled. I've been thinking about asking David. Mary's eyes widened in surprise. David. Rachel nodded, her eyes twinkling with pride. He's young, but he's passionate about the foundation. He's been involved for years, and I think he's ready to take on more responsibility. Of course, we'd still be there to guide him, but I think it's time for him to start making his own mark. Mary felt her heart swell with emotion. The thought of David taking over the foundation, carrying on the work that had started with Tom, felt like the perfect way to continue their legacy. It was a full-circle moment that felt deeply meaningful. I think that's a wonderful idea, Mary said softly. He's going to do great things. Rachel smiled, her eyes misting over with emotion. I think so too. A few months later, David officially took on a leadership role at the foundation. Though he was still young, he approached the position with a maturity and wisdom that belied his age. He worked tirelessly, organizing new programs, meeting with community leaders, and mentoring the next generation of volunteers. Mary watched with pride as David grew into his role, stepping confidently into the legacy that Tom had left behind. The foundation continued to thrive, expanding its reach and helping more families than ever before.
It was everything they had dreamed of and more.
One afternoon, as Mary sat in her office at the foundation, reviewing some paperwork, David knocked on the door and poked his head inside. Hey, Grandma, he said with a smile. Got a minute? Mary looked up from her desk and smiled warmly. Of course. Come on in. David stepped inside and sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about something, he began, his tone serious. Mary set down her papers, giving him her full attention. What's on your mind? David hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward, his eyes bright with determination. I want to start a new program at the foundation, something specifically for kids who have lost a parent. Mary's heart skipped a beat. That sounds like a wonderful idea, she said softly. What made you think of it? David glanced out the window, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately, he said quietly, about how much I wish I could have known him. And I know there are other kids out there who feel the same way about their parents' kids who are dealing with that kind of loss. I want to create a space where they can talk about it, where they can get support, and feel like they're not alone. Mary felt tears prick at her eyes. She had always known that David had a big heart, but hearing him speak with such passion and empathy filled her with pride. "That's a beautiful idea, David," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think your dad would be so proud of you." David smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just want to make a difference, like he did." Mary reached across the desk and took David's hand, squeezing it gently. "You already are," she said softly, "and I know this program will help so many kids. I'll do everything I can to support you." David nodded, his smile growing. "Thanks, Grandma. That means a lot." The program, called Healing Hearts, launched a few months later, and it quickly became one of the most successful initiatives at the foundation. Children who had experienced loss found a safe space to share their feelings, connect with others, and receive emotional support. The program offered counseling, art therapy, and group activities designed to help children process their grief in healthy and meaningful ways. Mary watched as the program flourished, and she couldn't help but feel that Tom's spirit was guiding them every step of the way. His dream of building a better future for the next generation was alive and well, carried forward by his son and the family he had left behind. As the years went by, the foundation continued to grow, and David eventually became its full-time director. His leadership was marked by compassion, innovation, and a deep commitment to the community. Mary remained involved, though she took on a more advisory role, content to watch as David and the team carried on the work she and Rachel had started. On a bright spring day, Mary, Rachel, and David gathered once again beneath the oak tree they had planted for Tom so many years ago. The tree had grown tall and strong, its branches spreading wide to provide shade and comfort. It had become a symbol of everything they had built together, of love, of family, and of the strength to overcome. As they sat together on a bench, watching the children play in the park, Mary felt a profound sense of peace. She had come so far on her journey from a place of fear and guilt to a life filled with love, forgiveness, and purpose. She had made mistakes, but she had worked to make things right, and in the process, she had built something beautiful. Rachel leaned against Mary's shoulder, her face soft with contentment. "We did it, Mary," she whispered. "We built something lasting." Mary nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. "We did," she whispered, "and it's all because of Tom." David, sitting across from them, smiled warmly. "He's the reason we're all here," he said quietly. "And we're going to keep his legacy alive for as long as we can." Mary's heart swelled with pride and love. She had been given a second chance, and she had made the most of it. She had found redemption, not just for herself, but for her family and her community. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Mary looked up at the oak tree, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze. She thought of Tom, of everything he had stood for, and she smiled. His legacy would live on, through the foundation, through David, and through the love that had brought them all together. And for Mary, that was enough. Do you believe in second chances? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.